welcome to our special edition of The Last Sip. I'm Amara Jones, and this Memorial Day, we're giving you our full interview with Rashad Robinson, Executive Director of Color of Change. We discussed how Color of Change mobilizes its network of over 1 million members to create social change, and how communities of color can actively shift major political structures. Color of Change is a digital civil rights organization of nearly 1 million people who are organized and organize themselves into a broad array of campaigns to apply power to affect change and structural change. And so we're thrilled to be here to talk to you in our secret BAT location.
It's great to be here, and congratulations on the show.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So one of the reasons why we can't actually disclose where we are or even show B-roll of where we are leads into the first question that I want to ask you, which is, where, from the perspective of Color of Change, given sort of the breadth of your activities, offices all across the country, an array of campaigns, where are we on civil rights in the United States?
So I think we're in this place where people are having a lot of conversations. Every single day we're hit with all sorts of information about civil rights and racial justice. You know, we see Black Twitter, we see conversations happening at kitchen tables, but we can't mistake presence, visibility, or even awareness for power. And we say that a lot at Color of Change. And oftentimes, just because there's big conversations, just because we have a pop star that can stop the internet when she announces she's pregnant or shuts down a major concert, just because we have a Black first family or had a Black first family in the White House, doesn't mean that that actually changes the rules. And power is the ability to change the rules. And so I think right now, in terms of where we're at, structurally, in terms of civil rights in this country, is about building enough power to force decision makers to be nervous, to force real change to the rules, both the written rules of policy and the unwritten rules of culture. And actually, Color of Change is well over 1 million members now. We're about 1.25 million members all around the country, Black folks and their allies of every race who are trying to translate that presence into power.
Mm-hmm. So given the need to translate presence into power, what is the thing right now in the perception of race in this country that isn't making people nervous, right? Because you're saying we have to use this power to make people nervous so that we can change structures. So what about where we are in race in the country isn't making people nervous?
No, I mean, I think in many ways we're at this place where people see conversations, they hear information, but folks are not oftentimes pushed to actually have to do anything. We hear these things like, we need to have a conversation around race. And I'm like, no, we need action on race. We've had a lot of conversations about race. We like to think about that there's all sorts of opportunities to take action. There's so many places, from criminal justice to economic justice to what's happening in voting rights and democracy. And so we think about what's the right lever, what's the right pivot point, where if we direct that energy, we can force actual change. And what are the right strategies? And so sometimes it's, getting people aligned around a petition, or making phone calls, or running ads, or doing the inside-outside game. All sort of leveraging attention, energy, and power, so those who are making decision recognize that there will be consequences for ignoring, for abusing, for mistreating Black folks. And as a result of building power here at Color of Change, when we win victories for everyone. When Black people win, they win structural equality for all people.
I mean, I think that the strategy is important that you're talking about, the way that you mobilize, the way you're applying pressure. But I'm curious as to where you think the pressure points are needed given where we are on race in this country.
Yeah, so I think really we have a lot of opportunity with corporations. Corporate power has really impacted every facet of our life, from the criminal justice system to media justice to the economy. And so often we direct our marches at our energy, whether they are our figurative or literal marches, at government and halls of power, when actually the sort of Geppetto to Pinocchio is actually the Geppetto. The folks who are controlling things are actually the corporations and corporate power, and the ways that corporations have gained deeper power since Citizens United. We think a lot about narrative and narrative power here, and sort of the story that we immerse people in that sort of moves them to action and action on the right things. Far too often people see inequality, poverty, racism as unfortunate, almost like a car accident. And when I say some people, it's not even like our opponents on the right. Sometimes like in our barbershops or our beauty salons, folks who are poor are sort of blamed for their interactions. And we see it throughout pop culture. Some of the biggest movies that come out are sort of about this bootstrap mentality without actually recognizing how do we actually get people boots in the first place so they can have bootstraps. So people see inequality as unfortunate rather than unjust. Then we get the wrong things. And so then people will operate with black people and black culture from a charity mindset. Oh, we need to build empathy for black folks. And we at Color of Change believe we need to build power. We need to build power to change the rules. When people build empathy, what we get is false solutions. We get things like cleaning up inner city schools instead of actually changing the inequality of public education. We get reentry programs instead of ending mass incarceration. In so many contexts, over and over again, when people stop at empathy rather than power, we get solutions that don't actually end the hostile climate that black people live in. And so we approach each situation as how do we change the written and unwritten rules? And how do we give voice, not just to the structures that are impeding people, because that's important, but who is actually manufacturing inequality? Because moving people from seeing bad decision makers, that they may say poor people are bad decision makers, right? They may say that. And we say, oh no, it's structural. That's like moving people from apples to elephants, not even apples to oranges. What we have to be better at doing, and what oftentimes traditional organizations that take a lot of money from corporations, the mainstream Democratic Party, many of those institutions are unable to actually name the opponents, to name those folks that are manufacturing inequality and poverty, the big corporations, political leaders, because they're all tied together.
That was the first part of our conversation with Rashad Robinson, Executive Director of Color Change. More after this break. Here's more of our conversation with Rashad Robinson, Executive Director of Color of Change. In this work that you're doing, one of the things that you do is name names.
Yeah.
So let's start naming names,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But from your perspective, give us some of the leading structures, organizations, institutions, corporations, and people that you believe are upholding a system of racism that keeps people of color at a disadvantage.
Yeah, so it's a couple of buckets, right?
Okay.
So like there is like the deep right-wing infrastructure from the Heritage Foundation to the Koch brothers to ALEC that colludes with right-wing media structures like Fox News, right-wing radio. There's all of that infrastructure. There's a network of organizations in the state, these policy networks, which have been strategic at undermining people's ability to organize in the workplace, have had deep attacks on civil rights, reproductive rights, all these organizations that in the communities that are working to build power, help communities be able to do, have a sense of equality and build power. So those institutions are all at play. Then there's the enablers. There are the mainstream corporations that if we allow them, they play see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil, and they kind of keep their toe in both areas. I remember when we were reaching out to the companies that were supporting ALEC, and I remember we called it up and they were like, we give a little to the left and we give a little to the right. And we're like, that's great, but there's not two sides to black people voting. So you're gonna have to make a moral choice. I remember as we kept going on for that campaign, we would have these back and forth conversations while we had our public campaign. We weren't really calling out the corporations yet. And by the last call, they would get their senior level black person on the phone with me, and they would talk about voting with their grandfather, and I would talk about voting with mine. I remember, a very benign company, Kraft, was supporting, or benign to us in our heads, right, was supporting ALEC and had money in ALEC, and they, until we forced them not to anymore. And I remember getting on the phone and saying, black people like macaroni and cheese. So, if we call this out right before and forced these companies, over 100, to divest, but they would have been perfectly fine having their money there. Just like all of those companies that we went after as the lead up to the RNC convention happened. We mobilized our members. We forced many of these companies to step away from the RNC convention because things that Donald Trump was saying on the campaign trail. The minute Donald Trump wins, they all join the Trump Business Council. And they stay in the Trump Business Council until Charlottesville happens. Right? And so what are the rules and norms of society? What is it okay and not okay to say? And I remember when I was at GLAAD years ago, and we led efforts to basically, there was a time when anytime they had a story about gay people, they had someone who had went through reparative therapy, or from the Catholic bishops, that there were two sides, right? And we had to change that. And the rules and norms change. We're like, you don't see that on CNN anymore. You may see people that disagree with policies, but you don't see that on TV the same way. Over time, you have to start changing the rules. I think back to a moment, a missed opportunity with all of this, about seeing not just policy and seeing culture and how we name names. What if the progressive movement had stopped Donald Trump at Celebrity Apprentice? He was traveling around the country and he was doing his birther tour on President Obama, while at the same time being given a platform to be seen as a mainstream good businessman. Could he have done that about a Jewish person? He could do it about a black person. How do we change the rules and norms of society so that the rules and norms of institutions, whether they be media, whether they be government, to push the needle over time? And from my perspective, that creates a more human and a less hostile world.
The Last Sip, we'll be right back. This is the Last Sip Memorial Day edition. We're talking with Rashad Robinson of Color of Change about mobilizing for collective action. So to the degree that we've allowed corporations to grow and power in the United States, it may be one of the reasons why challenges around race and racism are new. So I want to hear your thoughts about that. And you've mentioned that ALEC plays a role in that. And I'm wondering if you can take a minute to explain what ALEC is. The other thing that I think, just kind of in your comments that you're saying, is that there's an entire infrastructure that resists change around race and racism, right? And that it works in cohort, and that at the center of that, again, is corporate money and power that's influencing, that's funding. If you look at the Koch brothers, right? They're funding the organizations that you mentioned. They were big proponents of ALEC. They fund an entire right-wing media organization. They fund candidates. So there's an entire infrastructure at which corporate power and corporate money is present. And I think that most people don't think about the role that corporations play in race and racism in the United States.
So, one of the reasons why is when Color of Change was founded, we made a strategic decision not to accept any money from corporations or government. We're the only national black civil rights organization in the country that does not take corporate money. And that, in many ways, also gives us a level of go-to-market strategy and freedom to run the type of unapologetic campaigns on corporations. But you're absolutely right. It does come down to a set of rules that have been changed. It's not just that corporations are not as incentivized as government to, without rules, to deal with diversity. It's that they work through their tax policies and tax practices to actually deregulate. And so issues like the housing crisis of '08 that basically wiped out about 75% of black wealth. Black people were buying homes, and those homes were sort of people's pathway to from poverty to working class to middle class. They were leveraging those homes to send children to school, to retire, a whole host of things. And it was absolutely wiped out by deregulation and choices that big banks could make. The only people that really went to jail off of that were protesters in the Occupy movement, not any of the bankers who stole black wealth. But since 1980, this has been an ongoing project of the right. Corporations and government colluded. And ALEC is really at the center of so much of that. They bring corporations and government leaders behind closed doors. And for the last 40 plus years, they've done this. And they basically write what they call model legislation. Legislation that's in the interest of these corporations. And then the state legislators who are sort of at these fancy gatherings go back home to their states and introduce this legislation, and legislation to advance more private prisons, legislation to make it harder to vote, legislation that makes it harder to organize in the workplace, that makes it harder to have your student debt forgiven. A whole host of laws that empower corporations and make it harder for people to actually climb up the economic ladder, that basically freezes the status quo and then allows them to make more. Right. Since 1980, income inequality has risen. So there was the last time that black and white wealth income was closing. And this is not a question about black people stopped working hard in 1980.
Right.
This is not a
the
question.
rules changed.
The rules changed. Yeah. And so, but because a lot of people, like I said, see inequality is unfortunate rather than unjust, then the solutions become mentorship programs, or like we need to just like volunteerism. I go out to Hollywood and I challenge Hollywood around the fact that there's structural exclusion to their writers' rooms, and they're like, maybe we should just go to high schools and tell these kids that these jobs are for them. I'm like, no, there are like black writers I know in Hollywood being excluded right now. Like there are people who are not getting in the door right now, and so part of that has been a project by corporations. And even with big diversity initiatives that don't actually deal with rule changes, what we are doing is sort of like taping over the problem, and then we don't get the actual types of changes because racism is a shapeshifter. And if we don't actually change the rules, and if we don't actually then enforce those rules and stay vigilant about the rules, the poll taxes of the 60s become the voter ID laws of the 2000s. Jim Crow becomes mass incarceration, even with rules. And so without rules, we actually end up with something much worse. We end up with structural and systemic exclusion.
Stay tuned to The Last Sip. We'll get back to our conversation with Rashad Robinson right after this break. You're watching The Last Sip. We're talking with Rashad Robinson from Color of Change. From this perspective that we're talking about, Donald Trump would not be a surprise, right? It would not be a surprise that someone could accumulate that much cultural capital, right? And cultural capital in a key touchstone of our times. So Krista Friedland, who's now the Minister of Trade for Canada, used to be a reporter. And her last book was on the rise of what she said as the CEO as the hero of our times.
Yep.
And so within that framework, a person who is able to accumulate cultural capital within a pop culture framework, who also seems to be the representative of what is the hero of our times, the CEO, it's not necessarily a surprise that that person could become president. And these different types of intersections, the overlap of sort of pop culture, social media, cultural capital, business, and political insight, I think I would argue, is probably what your insight is as a leader.
Well, it also what makes us unique and of the times, right? Trying to be where people are and where people live, and trying to not fall into the magical thinking that just because like we're sitting in an office here as social justice activists and we think a certain way doesn't mean our people always are with us, let alone that we have the sort of story and narrative power to actually move our opponents. And so there's a magical thinking that can sometimes happen on the left, where we think that we can code our way out of things, or that we can nonprofit executive direct our way out of things, or if we just have a research report and we get like all the numbers to people, that they'll just see the numbers and like they'll be like, aha, you know what, this is racist, and we'll stop it.
Right.
So what's important about all those systems is that they are about power. And so understanding power and how power operates allows us to apply that thinking to new things as they come down the pike, right? The new platforms as they come down the pike. And this has been nothing new for Black people. Like the story that I always go back to in all this is a story that the late Julian Bond used to tell. And he told me this story about how they installed the Watts line in their Shore University office. And Watts was the precursor to the 1-800 number. It allowed folks to call long distance without having to go through the Ma Bell operators. Back then you had a call, then they transferred an operator, transferred your call, and then transferred your call. But in the South, they were largely controlled by the White Citizens Council and the KKK.
Right.
So if there was a call going from Tuskegee to Howard,
They would listen in.
They would listen in, share the information, right? And so Watts was not their theory of change. If the SNCC didn't have a theory about power and about what they were doing, they could have had Facebook. They could have had Twitter, and it would have not helped them.
That's
they had
right.
a clear theory of change, and then they could apply it to new systems and use new technology to move people in powerful ways. And so the intersection of like what forces collude to hold Black people back and what type of campaigns we have to build to champion the solutions that move all of us forward
Right.
is what we do here, and not falling into a magical thinking that just because something worked before doesn't mean it's going to work again.
What is the relationship you believe between digital activism in all its forms and direct action?
I think that they go hand in hand. I think especially in today's time, how we reach people and get people to move. And increasingly, sometimes direct action tactics can happen through digital.
Right.
The ways that we can take over a social media platform of an opponent and cause havoc that way is a form of direct action and a form of holding up their ability to do business, right? When I think of what Rosa Parks, the strategy that she and the Montgomery bus boycotters applied to that sort of strategic bus boycott, there are all types of ways where we can apply strategic interventions that force institutions to do something they don't want to do. And direct action will look different over time. And I think it's partially because we just don't live in geographic communities.
That's
the
true.
forces that are holding us back are not just geographic. We live in geographic, we live in racial, we live in virtual communities. Like I'm much more in touch with people on my social platforms than I am in my own building. And to the extent that that will only become more over the years, how we leverage technology to force change will also have to change as well.
Right. The Last Sip continues after this break. Welcome back. Here's the last portion of our Memorial Day special with Rashad Robinson, the Executive Director of Color of Change. One of the interesting things about your organization is that you actually give your more than 1 million members the ability to be able to do that, right? You have a special program, Organized For, I believe that's called, and others that are able to do that. Can you talk about the ability to, how you're able to mobilize your network through their own initiative?
Yes. So we have this theory that with all of our campaigns, respond, build, pivot, and scale. Respond to moments that are happening out in the world. When the tragedy of Sandra Bland hits people's on the news, how do we help people respond to that? Then how do we help people build energy? Then what is the systemic pivot? So that we're not just playing whack-a-mole with issues impacting our community. We want justice for Sandra Bland, but we also want to change the rules. Sandra Bland was in jail over the weekend with a $5,000 bail for a traffic infraction. How do we actually then deal with the rules around bail, the way that the sheriff, the bail bonds person, the judge, and the district attorney could collude to give disproportionately high bail to not just Sandra, but a ton of other Black people who were going through Waller County. We could then deal with the fact that her family was trying to get together that money and she never got out.
That's right.
So we then pivot to the systemic thing that starts raising the floor on what's acceptable and pushing up the ceiling on what's possible. And then we scale that energy over time. And so to the extent that like we're always giving someone something to do, that's the only strategic way to engage. Like,
Right.
Everyone is gonna like get on their Facebook or Twitter that's on social media and do their rants. What we hope to do is that when that thing happens, we're the email that hits your inbox that says this is the thing to do.
Right.
And you can be aligned and engage with a group of other people across the country, black folks and their allies of every race, and we can collectively, like in that moment, have something real to do. And that is how we make justice real. That's how we build the type of power that changes this country.
Well, I think the good news in all of this is that change is possible,
Yeah.
that there are solutions to systemic racism, and that's what you all work on every single day across the country. What you've been able to do on Bill O'Reilly, on Pat Buchanan, you name it, there's a whole list of successes that people can read about shows that. And so it's been wonderful to be able to sit down and talk to you about what you do and how you do and the fact that there is change. That was the Last Sips Memorial Day special with Executive Director of Color of Change, Rashad Robinson. For more information on Color of Change and ways that you can get involved in social progress, go to our website, www.thelastsip.org, and click on How to Help. Thanks for watching, and tune in next week.